right, you guys, we are going to be all right. I usually have it set up so that we need to get started by a quarter after, and we are still in that zone. So welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to get us a little housekeeping squared away so that we can be good to go. So first off, welcome to our Computerside Chats. I'm Missy Patterson. I'm really glad that you're going to be here with me today. So hopefully everybody can hear my voice right now. You can see the audio. It looks like we're good. So the last thing on this housekeeping slide that I want to do is make sure a couple of things. One, that you have your chat window open because we're going to make a lot of use of that. So do click on the chat option on your menu bar for WebEx. When that comes down, you should see a little bar that says send to. And there's a drop-down button. I want to make sure everybody clicks on that and then selects everyone. It'll generally be set to just send a private message to one individual, and then I won't get to see what you're sending. So if everybody can take a minute and click on send to everyone. And then the way we're going to check that out is I'm going to have all of you chat in your name that you prefer to be addressed by and your ACC email address. So today in the Computerside Chats, we're going to be discussing chapters 1 and 2 of this book. It's called Teaching for Learning, and it is a great resource. You can tell how much I like it. And it's also available on the FCTL library collection, so you can get it through the ACC libraries if you want to read the whole thing on your own. But the cool thing about Computerside Chats is it's the book club where you don't have to read, and I'm going to walk you through the process. So we'll cover chapters 1 and 2. So the way the session's going to work is for each chapter, 1 and 2, we'll discuss some of the research that the authors provide. We'll go over a few of the selected activities, and then you're going to be challenged to pick a favorite activity of the ones that we discuss and share how you might use it in your courses. That's actually my favorite part of these Computerside Chats because I get a lot of inspiration from you guys when you share how you're going to use it in your classes. Even if it's a completely different class from what I teach, it often sparks my imagination and gives me new ideas, and I hope you'll find the same thing. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities throughout to vote on your preferences for which things we're going to cover. And like I said, we're going to keep you muted, but if you want to speak instead of chatting in, please unmute yourself, but just remute yourself after you're done so we can avoid all that feedback. So if you have any questions, chat them into me, and otherwise I'm going to get started, but I'll keep an eye out for those chats. All right, so again, as I mentioned, I'm Missy Patterson. I am a faculty member, professor in the psychology department, and I'm also serving as Assistant Dean for Faculty Development and running the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning, which is better known as the FCTL. And this is one of the FCTL events. We always try to do things where faculty are sharing with faculty, so that's really the goal here. So chapter 1 is over lecture methods, and I'm going to give you some basics, then we're going to talk about some best practices from the research. So most of us, I think, were probably taught through the lecture method, and even though there's been a whole lot of talk about how more engaged strategies can be much more valuable in terms of teaching our students, the research is still suggesting that the majority of faculty use this. This research is a little bit older, but there's even more current things that are demonstrating that, yes, the majority of college faculty are still using the lecture method as their default method. There's a lot of great things about it, but I'm going to try to give you some ideas about how the authors encourage us to alter the lecture method to be more engaging and valuable for our students. So some benefits is that you can really progress through more material through lecture than you can through any other method. It is a fast, rapid-fire way of getting information across. It's also really valuable for factual material or discussing through a deep conceptual understanding. One of the other things that you'll hear me mention over and over again is this issue about a framework. One of the biggest distinctions that psychologists outline between people new to our fields and we as experts is that experts tend to have a really big framework, a broad view of the field, so it's easier for us to make new connections. Novices see everything as separate and disparate, and so they're not able to make those connections. Therefore, they forget stuff more quickly. So one of the things that's important for us as faculty members is to provide that framework so our students can kind of tap into the expert perspective and begin to learn in that way. And lecture can allow us to do that. We can show people our big, broad view, and that's really helpful. It also allows instructors to be viewed as role models. We can demonstrate professional behavior. We can demonstrate the appropriate way to pronounce words in our field. And lastly, some students actually prefer lecture. Because they're used to it, they feel like they're learning, even though the research doesn't hold that up. So since we started a little bit late, I'm going to hold off on asking for comments right here. But if you have anything that you have questions about, please chat in anytime, and I will absolutely get to those. So some drawbacks of the lecture method. One is it is absolutely passive. Unless you engage your students in some different ways, they will often not be connecting to the material as much as we think. That other methods seem to have more research support for being effective for learning and engagement. If you're doing straight lecture, it can really be hard to tell if your students are even learning. And they can become bored because if they're not brought into the lecture, they can lose interest. And so those are some important things to really think about. Lastly, a big one for me is that students feel if they've sat through a lecture that they're done. And I would encourage all faculty to remind our students that sitting through a lecture and hearing it is not the same as understanding or learning or remembering, and that there's a lot of work to be done after a lecture. Students need to actively engage with their notes, they need to ask questions, they need to reflect, they need to plan for how they're going to remember that material. And when all we do is lecture, we often don't reinforce that information. I don't know if you guys can hear all the noise that I can hear, but my office mates are being awfully loud, so I'm just apologizing if you can. Lots of doors slamming. Okay, so a quote I loved is this one that says that lectures would benefit from remembering that transmitting knowledge doesn't guarantee that student learning occurs. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because you can talk all day long and students may not be receiving what you're giving out. And in psychology, we often talk about the message and then whether the message is being received in the same way that it's being given out. So it's important to check in for knowledge. It's important to check in for understanding. And that's something that we'll just talk about as we move through the best practices. So any questions or concerns about the lecture method so far before we move into some of the research and some best practices? Chat in if you have any concerns. All right, I'm assuming we're good. So I'm going to bounce on over to these best practices. This chapter, I believe, has 5 findings, and so I'll go through all of them and then we'll review them at the end so that you'll have a chance to really think about them. So finding 1, research suggests that student attention doesn't last for very long. Usually about 10 to 15 minutes is all that they can attend to, and then they're going to just be distracted and focusing on other things. So if you lecture for 30 minutes at a time, you are basically spinning your wheels for the second or for the latter 20 minutes. The suggestion here to combat that is to do mini lectures with breaks every 10 or so minutes to get everybody back engaged, to check for understanding, and to just make sure that people are with you instead of droning on and on. So I would encourage you to consider using mini lectures. And most of the tips that we'll go through today are actually modified mini lectures, so you'll have a lot of ideas of how to do this. So the second finding is effective and guided note-taking during lecture can improve student learning. I don't know about you guys, but I find that many of my students don't even realize that they need to take notes. And if they know that they should take notes, they may not have a method that is working for them. Often students don't realize they need to date their notes, that it's a good idea to list the exam number at the top of each page so they have a ready reference for which chunk of information they're studying for when they look at those notes. And so the research suggests that providing some kind of skeletal note guide is valuable, or at the very least providing some information about how to be a good note taker. So I do this with my students every semester. I show them an example of the way that I take notes, You might want to show them an example of the way you take notes, but to really reinforce the idea that without good notes and without referring to and engaging with the notes regularly, they're going to lose all of what they hear. In fact, research suggests in my field that within 30 minutes of hearing information, if we don't use it, we lose it. So that is true for whether we understood it or didn't. So students might leave your lecture feeling like, I got it, I understand it. But if they don't have good notes, they really don't got it. So I encourage you to consider sharing the importance of note-taking, especially if you use the lecture method. So finding 3 is focusing on the essentials can help improve learning. And I've mentioned I was going to come back to this again and again, experts see relationships that students don't. And so very often if you're lecturing and you think of a connection and you want to bring it in, you may know completely why that's a good example or why you're going to that place, but students may see it as a tangent. And we're encouraged by the authors of this book to avoid tangents, to avoid jumping to too many connections, and instead to let students figure out connections. So if you provide some information, encourage your students to make some connections and share them with the class rather than you doing all the work for them because they may not be following your leaps the way you expect. And research actually suggests that when we share too many interesting details about our own research or about things that we've read and we don't focus on the lesson at hand, that it can harm student learning. So I encourage people to constantly remind students about the take-home message. What's that take-home message? So for instance, right now, we've gone through 3 findings, and I want to remind you guys that the take-home message so far is that mini lectures are a good idea, that focusing on the essentials really matters, and that students may need some help with note-taking skills. So any questions before I jump on to the last 2 findings? And we'll have a minute to review these after we're done too. Okay. All right, so last 2. Finding 4, frequent quizzing and testing can help learning. This one is a big deal. It turns out that when we sit through lecture, we may be doing all that we need to do if we're really good students and good note takers to push information into our long-term memory. But it turns out that retrieving or pulling stuff out of our long-term memory is a completely separate skill, one that we need to practice with all the material that we try to shove into our long-term memory. So the more frequently you quiz and test your students, the more practice they're getting with retrieval of information, which turns out is at least as important as pushing the information into long-term memory. And in addition, the more we practice retrieving and recall, it improves future recall. So even though students might balk, it turns out that the more quizzing and testing you can do, the better, especially with the lecture method. I use the clicker method. I love it. I use clickers in the classroom all the time to put up questions on the board and then allow students to respond. There's a lot of free software out there that you could use without clickers and using students' phones. One I love is polleverywhere.com. I'll type it into the chat window so you guys have it if you're interested. But I find it really user-friendly, and the students love it. They love being able to respond to questions right there in class. And if they get answers wrong, that will train them about what they need to do differently. Helen says, can discussion about the points serve as this recall device instead of quizzing them? It can, except that I will point out that right as we're discussing things, we're actually keeping that information in our short-term memory. And so while you're processing and understanding things, it is essentially not practice of retrieval, it's just practice working with the information. So I'd encourage you maybe to speak for a while, give them some tasks to do, and then asking for them to see if they can recall. And a technique I'll often use is I ask them a question at the end of one lesson, and I see how everybody's doing, but then I ask the very same question at the beginning of the following lesson. And that is more the retrieval thing that we're looking for, is that pulling it out of long-term memory. Does that make sense, Helen? So I really think, and also it's got the extra bonus of if you quiz them at the end of one class and at the beginning of the next, sometimes they'll be like, oh my gosh, I forgot it all. I might actually need to study between. I see. So Helen's saying that quizzing can introduce a stress reaction for many students. It doesn't have to be for points. I use the clickers, I don't count them for points. I tell students as long as they respond, whether they get it right or wrong, I'm going to give them credit for participation. So it can be low stakes or no stakes with these quizzes, but you really help your students when you give them practice with retrieval. All right, great. Thanks, Helen, for your question. That was awesome. All right, so that's quizzing. And finding 5, style and pace of speech can improve learning. I'm sure you guys all know that. If you go too slow, people get bored. If you go too fast, people can't keep up. Research suggests that about 120 words per minute is best. You can try timing yourself and seeing how it goes, almost like taking your impulse. Expressiveness is important. While we may not want to pull in a ton of tangents, demonstrating through your behavior and your tone that you love this material, that you care about it, students point out as one of the things that makes them appreciate an instructor the most, is when we show our own passion for our field. So I encourage you to think about your tone of voice and to make sure you're not going too quickly, and that you check in with your students so that you know that it's working for them. I every once in a while just say, hey, how's the speed working for you guys, and see if it works for them. So those are our top 5 findings from the book, and I want you to take a minute and do this on your own. It's just a good opportunity for you to reflect, make sure you're clear on all the best practices, but you don't have to share this with everybody. So rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 5, how good you think you currently are at making use of all these best practices. So 0 to 5, and I call it 0 to rock star. So 0 means you don't do it at all. 5 means you do it constantly and you're amazing at this. So think about it. How are you at using mini lectures? Remembering that students' attention spans will fail. Do you offer help with note-taking? Do you stick to the essentials, or do you find yourself hopping to a lot of really exciting examples that you love? Do you use testing and quizzing, and how do you think your style and pace of speech are? So just take a minute to assess yourself on those. And every once in a while you'll see me looking at my phone. I promise I'm not being tacky, I'm just checking our time to make sure I'm keeping it on the right speed. Because for whatever reason, it doesn't show up on my computer. All right, so my goal is, once you have these ratings, they might help you figure out which of the tips that I'm gonna share with you, you might wanna hear about. So if you need more practice with mini lectures, maybe pick some of the tips that focus on that. And anything else that you think might be valuable, but I wanted you to have those in your head before we moved on. So this is the part where I think it gets really exciting. The authors present these things called ideas, and these are intentionally designed educational activities. They provide about 10 to 15 in each chapter, and we of course do not have time to go through all of those. But what I've done is I've selected a few from each chapter. I'm going to briefly share a summary of what they're like, and I'm going to let you guys vote on which ones you want to hear about. So, and I meant to change these numbers because they're a little confusing, but we'll get through it. So here are the ideas I have for your consideration, and what I would encourage you to do is focus on the idea number over here rather than the number. I should have changed these to bullets, but I didn't. So we've got idea number 2, which is the pause procedure, and this is basically just when you do a mini lecture and you remind yourself that you need to take breaks, and then you give them some information that they need to process during that pause, during that lecture pause. The punctuated lecture is actually, I think, really lovely because it's the pause procedure again. So you do a mini lecture and then you pause. But here you actually provide some questions that get students to assess their own metacognition, their own ability to think about how they're thinking and to think about how they're handling the material. So you're going to give them some metacognitive prompts in the pauses that can help you and your students assess how the lecture is going for them. The interpreted lecture, this one I actually also like. It's again the modified pause procedure, where instead of asking them some metacognitive questions, you ask a student, you'll pick a student to summarize what they've heard thus far. So you would lecture for about 10 minutes, you'd pause, you'd pick a student who would summarize the material for everybody else, and you can invite everybody to help add in. So it's a very communal kind of friendly thing. It's not stressful. The next one is take a guess. And on this, the idea is you ask students to guess what they're going to be hearing. So if you've given a reading assignment, you can bring that in and say, hey, which of the things from the readings do you think are going to be important in today's lesson? Write them down, guess what you expect will be talked about today. And that's really valuable for students because it gets them to start becoming experts at picking out the most important information from their reading. And then the last one, lecture bingo, is kind of a modified take a guess. Here is where you provide some topics of the day that you're planning on covering, and you ask students to play bingo with those topics, making sure they're staying on task and keeping track of what they're hearing so that they can, respond to those. So lecture bingo is sort of an attention-getting exercise to try to get students to really focus in on what's happening. And then it also is nice at the end of the day, they can take a list of all the things that were covered away with them. So we've got 5 different options, and I'm going to ask each of you to chat in which idea you would like to hear about. And we'll go from there. So if you like the pause procedure, please type in number 2, because that's idea 2. If you like take a guess, please chat in number 8. And I will mark these down, keep track of them, and we'll get it all squared away. So we've got 2 for 9. And Helen, if you would chat in, that would be great. I don't want to skip it. Anybody? All right. Oh, Helen, 3. Perfect. So idea 3. That's the punctuated lecture. All right. So I'm going to start with the punctuated lecture. We'll do lecture bingo, and then if we're doing okay for time, I'll get to pick one too. That's very exciting for me. So, okay. So let me get over to the interpretive lecture. My mouse has just gone away. Fascinating. Okay, hold on. There we go. Interpretive lecture. Okay. Oh no, it's punctuated. Sorry, y'all. There we go. All right, so we're starting with punctuated lecture. And as I mentioned, this is where you're going to do mini lectures, so 10 to 15 minutes, and then you'll take a break, and you're going to ask students to reflect on what they were doing during the lecture part to see if they're processing properly or if there's anything that they could do differently. So for each of these ideas, I will be giving you a process. I'll give you some preparation if that's needed, and then we're going to vote on how we feel about it after we've heard about all of it. So again, mini lecture, take a break, and you can actually give students the questions on the board if you prefer. You could produce a handout, whatever you like. You could have it as a PowerPoint. I'm going to jump over to show you some example questions that the authors suggest you might want to ask. And so these are those metacognitive questions, things that focus on them as learners and how they're working to learn. So here's some examples. Were you fully concentrating on the lecture when we stopped? What were you doing to record the information? So this is great because it gives you the chance to weave in those note-taking skills right there in the middle of the lesson. What were you doing to make connections between this new information and stuff we've already discussed? And for a lot of these, if their answer is nothing, you've got a ready moment for you to talk to them about, okay, well, here's the connection that I made. Let's talk about some other connections. Did you get distracted at any point? If so, what distracted you? Were you able to bring your attention back to focus? You can also ask questions about content, so things like what was the most recent thing we were just talking about, because they could say they were paying attention, but if they can't pick out the actual thing that you were covering, they maybe weren't, and that can really help. You can ask them predictive questions like, we've just covered this, what do you think is coming next? And you can also ask at that point, Are there any things that you're doing right now to prepare for the test? Are you leaving space in your notes? Are you creating memory devices? Are you drawing a picture instead of just writing the notes? So give them some tips on things that will help improve their memory. So any questions on these questions? All right, so I'm going to bounce back here. What I'd like you to do is, and so after you ask those questions, you jump right back into lecture. And you can do it again, or you can take a different kind of pause, but this is to encourage instructors to mini lecture and also to use those breaks really effectively with students to make sure they're on task. So I'd love you to gut check now. And so give me a 1 if you think, I don't think I would ever use this in class. It doesn't fit with the kinds of students I have or the topics I cover. Or 5, I think this is super useful and I'm likely to try it next class. So anywhere in that range, 1 to 5, if you'll chat in what your thoughts are. So Lauren gives it a 4, Lynn not so into it, that's okay. And Helen, just above the middle. Okay, so the reason I'm asking you guys to do this gut check is because at the end of our discussion of these ideas, I want you guys to reflect and think about a way you could actually use it. So traditionally, if you're not thrilled with it, if you're giving it a 1, you're not going to want to reflect on that one. So take that into consideration. So maybe mark down what you're rating it so you can remember when we go back. So Lynn says she can see the efficacy, but so much to cover. Yeah, the truth is, I hear you. But if we lecture through with no breaks, there's a difference between having said it and our students having received it. And so you really do need to give them some time to process. I'm not saying, Lynn says she doesn't do that. I'm not saying you do, but the idea is that if you give the little breaks for those metacognitive tasks, we can do a lot to be teaching the skills for success in our students and not just the content that we're set to teach. But I know it's hard. So Lynn says she uses mini lectures and activities. That's awesome. That's really good. And this is just another option. And I think, you know, you can do it every once in a while or never do it. It's all cool. So, all right. So let's see. The other one that y'all wanted to do was lecture bingo. Let me bounce over to lecture bingo. There we go. All right. So this one I really like. Oh, sorry, Lynn is saying, okay, hold on, let me scroll down because they moved up from the chat. So Helen's saying, I've done mini lectures with the BICM Fist of 5 to determine effectiveness. I'm not familiar with the Fist of 5. Maybe you can let me know what that is. And she says, I have upper level and see this as something students need to learn at EDUC 1300. Absolutely. And all of those students who are in there, I hope they'll be exposed to these kinds of things. But for those who haven't been, it's something you can try or not. Either you're the best gauge of your students. If you think that they are attending well, if you think they have the skills to take good notes, then you can ignore all of that stuff. They're good. But if you find that students are struggling and more than just 1 or 2, that is a way to intersperse that or infuse that into your lessons. So Lauren says, I just started to teach EDU 1300 in the summer and worked on similar skills, but didn't do check-ins during class breaks. So yeah, so maybe it's something that we could do, because I do think that online processing, like while we're in the lesson, students need some practice with that, and so that that style would help. And Helen says, BICM teaches math here and has the students raise a fist with no pick. Oh, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a low-tech clicker technique. And that can absolutely work. I do something similar that we'll talk about in a bit, where I let students put up color-coded cards. So red means do not call on me, I have no clue. Green means I'm good. So those kinds of things can be super, super helpful for check-ins. That sounds great. All right, cool. So idea 9, the one that you guys asked for, is lecture bingo. And this is really to help students keep track of topics as they're presented. And you can also connect it to your reading and things like that. So before lecture, the preparation that is going to be required from you is to come up with a list of several concepts that you know are going to be important. But if you've got your learning objectives for the day, that should be pretty easy to do. And then if you do a search on Google for free bingo card generator, it comes up with tons. And they're very easy to use. You can find the one that you like. You just type in your content areas into a bingo card generator, and then you print those out for students. You do not need a separate card for every student, but you do want to make sure there are different cards. I would encourage you to do at least a few different cards. Otherwise, everyone will bingo at the same time, and there's nothing worse than that. So that's the prep ahead of time. You create your list, you create the bingo cards, and then you print them out. So the process, you're going to announce that this is a game that you guys are going to be playing during the lecture. You explain how students should mark cards. Some people give out M&Ms, so there's snacks along with card marking. You could just tell them to X them out. The big deal here is if you're wanting to reuse the cards, you need to make that clear to your students. You just have students mark as you're going through your lecture, and then when a student yells bingo, you can go, oh, cool, let's talk about what we just covered and make sure that everybody's got the same things, or you can allow several bingos before you do that. You can do it individually, you can do it in teams, but the idea here is getting students to keep track of what's being covered as it goes on. So that's lecture bingo. So again, I'd love for you guys to gut check and do 1, not likely to be something you would want to use, and 5 instead, meaning you really like this idea. So take a minute and chat that in to me. All right, not getting any chats in. Did you all need a little more explanation?
Got 2 files.
Oh, you're standing. Yo, I'm so sorry I didn't scroll down. Lynn, no problem. You're welcome to think. Yeah, the chat wasn't approaching. I mean, that wasn't updating. Okay. All right. Okay, so Lynn's giving it a 3. All right, cool. So let me just check in on my time. I think we're doing all right. Yeah. So I'm going to do one more for you guys. So humor me. So this one, interpreted lecture, is one of my favorites. So I'll see if I can sway you over to the dark side. So interpreted lecture is essentially, again, a modified pause procedure, so much like the punctuated lecture that we already talked about. But with this one, you're going to let students know ahead of time that you're going to ask for their help in interpreting the lecture. So the way it's going to go is you will lecture for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you're going to take a break, and you're going to randomly select a student. And you warn them ahead of time when you tell them how the process is going to work, so they should all be ready and aware that they might be called on. You randomly select a student, and then after that person has been chosen, you give everybody about a minute to summarize in their own words some of the key points from that part of the lesson. Then you go back to the student you've selected randomly, you ask them to share their summary with the rest of the class, and you let them know, hey, if you're struggling or if you need some backup, ask a friend because everybody else has already prepared to summarize this. So it's a really friendly experience. It's not putting people on the spot. They can absolutely decline, or you can have rules about that. But I do think that hearing a lecture in a student's voice instead of the instructor's voice can be a really powerful thing for the entire class. Plus, taking that pause and giving everybody a moment to summarize in their own words, that's demonstrating good note-taking techniques because they should be doing that on their own. They should be regularly stopping and summarizing. And so it gives them practice with a skill that they'll actually need. So then you would, after everybody's had their say, you resume lecture, and then you can repeat it again, calling on another student. So let me know what you guys think about this one for a gut check. Again, it's a pretty easy technique. It's just asking one student to summarize, but giving them the support of their classmates to do that. So 1 to 5. Okay. Stop looking at the chats because I'm sorry I missed them last time. Okay, so Lynn says she does this all the time, especially if students come in late. It can be super helpful, right? And some instructors actually have students write some summaries on the discussion board if you use Blackboard, even if it's an in-class section, because then students who miss will have a summary when they come back. So I love that idea. I do. I think that's a great one. And then Lauren gives it a 3 to 4. Helen says 5. She does it too, but they work as a group. That's lovely. And especially if you have some students who do get anxious or stressed out when they're called on individually, giving them the opportunity to work in groups is a great way to modify this. I love that idea. Super cool. So you guys have actually kind of jumped ahead to what I was hoping to do, which is sharing how, oh, Lauren likes the discussion board idea. Yeah, that was actually suggested on a previous Computerside Chat, so I can't take credit for it. All right, so let me bounce over here. So you guys are already starting to do this, share how you would use these. So in our session today, we've covered the punctuated lecture, the interpreted lecture, and lecture bingo. And you should have a sense of which of these is the most exciting to you. And I would love it if you would chat in for a moment how you might do this in your class. Some of you guys already started on that. But relate it to your topic or relate it to content if you'd like, because strangely enough, even if there's a chemistry instructor in here who's talking about lab work that I will never do with my students, somehow hearing that connection to their own area really can inspire other instructors to come up with great ideas. So think about picking one and just let us know, hey, I would use the punctuated lecture and here's how, or I would use lecture bingo and here's how. And these kinds of modifications that you guys are talking about, like letting people do it in groups instead, or doing it online, those kinds of things I would love to get your thoughts. So share what you think. Okay, and Lynn says, you keep saying every semester you'll use the pause procedure, but when pausing, having them intentionally do reflection of what was just talked about. Yeah, I think that is a trick. It's hard to use the pause procedure if you don't have a plan to engage them with the material in that time. It feels like a waste. But some of these other opportunities can help out. And Lynn says, but then time. I don't know what you mean by that. Can you clarify, Lynn? Okay, and Helen is saying she had a student indicate that he needs more hands-on tasks to stay focused. I think bingo will be a really great option. Yeah, and so, most of the generators, you can choose how big of a bingo card to use. You don't always have to go with the 5 across. So if you're not planning on covering that much material, you can do that. You can also put in free spaces if you want. Okay, Lynn says, meaning we need every minute of every class for the time taken to do these has to be calculated in. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And so when planning your lessons, think about how are you going to get through the material with short breaks in between. And it sounds like you mentioned before you're already doing a lot of this. So, if you are mini lecturing, maybe you don't have to use these procedures, but maybe you can incorporate them into some of the group work that you're doing already. So sometimes when I break into groups, if I'm having them attack a task that I want them to attack, I just throw in a metacognitive question right there, or I throw in a summary as their actual task. So those are some possibilities. But yeah, the time is tough. And you think an hour and 20 minutes is a long time. It's just not a long time. It never is. Okay, so Lauren says she'd like to try the take a guess idea in future classes, especially in a 16-week course where students have more time to complete reading assignments. It seems like a great way to check in. Yeah, it really is. And you can actually modify the bingo technique if you're a fan of that and get a student to create a bingo card. So it can be an assignment where you get a student to create a bingo card, or you get students to share what they're expecting to hear. Or on your bingo card, if you leave some free spaces, you can say, hey, you guys, from the reading, are there any other topics you think we should be covering? Let's put those in as well and see if we hit those. So, but it is a really valuable way to make sure that students are thinking about the material as they're hearing it. And also, because we're experts, we know the topic that we're covering. It can sometimes be difficult for students when we're just talking to figure out what topic we're attacking, so bingo helps with that as well. And Helen says she likes the idea of helping them make them from the reading. So cool. Great. All right. Did anybody else want to weigh in on things that we can do with any of these techniques? All right. Okay, so I'm going to bounce on over to chapter 2. But if you guys have any other things, I've got Nick here helping me keep an eye on these chats, so if I miss one, he'll flag me down, and I can bounce back easily. Okay, so chapter 2 is on discussion methods. And so we'll do the same thing here. I'll talk about some best practices, and then we will pick some ideas that you guys want to cover. So just some basics. The idea here with the discussion method, and you can use it integrated with a lecture method. I do want to be clear on that. You don't have to just go straight discussion all day. But the idea is that when students are given the chance to discuss information, they can reflect on it, they can take ownership of it. They're doing many of the things we're going to expect them to do on their exams or in other activities. It does, however, take a heck of a lot longer. And so those of you who are concerned with time, this is going to be a challenge, and it really is. But I encourage you to consider, every once in a while trying to make use of these techniques because they can be really valuable. So do be aware, though, it does take longer. All right, this slide, I am not going to go through this. I forgot to mention to all of you that after this session, probably either today or tomorrow, I'm going to email all these PowerPoints to you guys, and this will be just an extra gimme. It's got a long list of benefits of the discussion method, and I just kind of, you guys like that, yay. Absolutely, I'll be sending those out to you because then you'll get all of the ideas we didn't cover as well. But this one is really, it's just an extra, I want you to have it, but it's got some really nice research on why discussion can be so powerful. Helen's been taking screenshots. I'm so sorry, I should have told you that ahead of time. You can stop with the screenshots, you're golden. All right, so discussion method, some drawbacks, as you guys are totally aware of. It takes a good bit of preparation. Oh, yeah, Lynn, we are recording this as well. And so probably what I generally do is I look at both sessions and try to pick the one where I look the least doofusy, and then we put that one up. So if this is the least doofusy one, exactly Lynn. Anyway, so we'll pick which one will go up, but definitely one of the Computerside Chats covering chapters 1 and 2 will go up, so you have the whole recording. Okay, so a lot of preparation for discussion. It can be time consuming. And then there are the student considerations. I regularly have to convince my students that the research is on my side and that discussion is valuable, because a lot of times they feel like we're not getting as much information this way. You're not throwing as much at us. So they don't feel like they're learning as much. They may not want to participate. And so those are some of the challenges. But I would just encourage you, once you go through the next few slides, you should have some research backing to explain to your students why it's such a valuable technique. And I often find sharing that with them, showing them that, hey, I'm actually doing my homework. I'm looking to see what techniques are seen as the best, and that's why I'm bringing them into the class, not just because I think they'd be fun. So I think that can be really helpful. Okay, so we're going to jump into some of these best practices. Again, I will go through them. You're free to chat in with questions, and then we'll assess ourselves on them afterwards to make sure we have time to reflect. So finding one, active preparation for discussion improves learning. Now that's not about you guys, it's about your students. Students have to be ready for a discussion. If they're not doing their reading regularly, if they're not coming to class prepared, you can't do a good job of discussions. So there are some other tips that we'll go through about ways to help them get prepared. This semester, I've instituted having students write a brief reflection on a 4x6 index card as their ticket into class. And that ticket into class technique is pretty powerful. It doesn't take a lot of time, but usually I'll ask them for, what's one thing that you completely understood from the reading, what's a thing that you're struggling with, or tell me 2 things that you found most important about the reading. If you get them to engage in that kind of work and then provide proof that they've engaged in it, you'll have a much more prepared class. So that's something I'm doing, and you might have some other ideas. But they do need to be prepared for discussion. Research suggests that small group discussion works better. So you guys were talking about converting some of the activities we talked about before into small group instead of individual work, and that is really borne out by research, so I love that idea. Students sometimes can feel stressed when trying to discuss in a whole class environment, and also just the amount of time it takes is longer, because if you've got 36 students and you want to give most of them a chance to air their voice, it takes so long. But if you've got them in groups of 3 to 5, it takes less time for 3 to 5 to share what they think. So it can really, really help. Students of different ethnic backgrounds seem to respond better in small groups. So in terms of becoming culturally aware and sensitive to those needs of our students, small groups really do double benefits. So consider small groups and consider helping your students prepare ahead of time. So for finding number 3, grading participation improves participation. This one's probably not a huge surprise, but you may have heard a lot of people say students don't do optional. It's really true. And so if you can incorporate some low stakes techniques, so few number of points, or opportunities for earning points for participating, that can be really valuable. The authors mention that some researchers say that offering tokens that can later be exchanged for extra credit can be one way that you don't have to change your entire grading structure to accommodate grading discussions. And so the idea would be, you have to participate actively in this many discussions, and then I'll give you a couple extra credit points. Okay, so Lynn says she's moved away from this because then they often do the least to show they participated, often not substantial enough. And that's fine. Really, again, I'll always say that instructors know their own students best. But overall, the research is suggesting that if you don't grade it at all, if there's no component of your class that goes to participation, then students will often feel very comfortable just blowing it off entirely. So consider it, but you're the expert in your own classroom. Lauren says she has difficulty keeping the small groups on task, but at least they're making connections with classmates, which seems important. And it is important. And sometimes what I'll do to keep them on task is I'll just say, I want you to write down your findings on a piece of paper and turn that in. And then that could be the thing I grade. And it's just a check they did it or no, they didn't. So it's not a huge burden on me, but then they know that they're going to be held accountable for their work in those small groups. And I think that's exactly what this finding is pointing to. That if you just let them go, sometimes they're going to be talking about plans for next Friday. If you ask them to provide some evidence of the quality of their discussion, then they are more likely to engage in a high quality discussion. So Helen says she assigned related activities for them to do outside of class for participation points. That's super cool. If they don't engage in the discussion, they won't have enough info to complete the assignment. So that sounds great. It sounds like you're absolutely aware of this and are taking it into consideration. And the truth is, it's like a smorgasbord. I always tell people, these ideas are things that are out there and that are suggested, but you need to pick and choose the ones that work for you and then make them, pick them in ways that work for you. So it's not one size fits all. Lauren says it seemed they would complete the task quickly, then socialize while other groups were still working. It was a little disruptive. So you can combat this sometimes by providing a shorter amount of time than you might expect, and then challenge people to get it done in the amount of time that the fastest groups can do it. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is once you start seeing that socialization happening, mention and say, hey, I'm seeing some chatting going on and I love that you guys are becoming friends. We've really got to keep on task. So if everybody's done, we're going to move on. So that might help as well. Let's see. It also seems to help if you count off the groups to avoid them, to help avoiding them working with friends. I think that's a great idea. There's a lot of really cool stuff on the internet. You can look for ways to pair up or group students. You can give out, playing cards. You can have them have different group assignments throughout the semester, but there's a bunch of different ways to pair people up. And as long as you're sensitive to people's mobility issues, I encourage you to switch up the groups. And that will keep them from just always seeing it as, fun time to hang out with friends. All right, so good. Those are great ideas. So finding 4, comfort with class discussion and class community improves the level of learning. And so I think it was Lauren who mentioned that sometimes students get chatty. You know, a little bit of that might be okay because that sense of community makes students feel more comfortable with discussion. So the more you can become aware of your students' names, encourage your students to know each other's names, those kinds of things will increase the likelihood of good outcomes in your discussions because students will feel comfortable. I'm going to bounce on to the last one because this one to me is the most shocking finding. I'm a little surprised by it, but I trust the researchers and I feel like it's a good thing to discuss. So cold calling, and I've defined it here for you on the slide, is asking a specific student to contribute and often without warning. So you could tell people ahead of time, I'm going to pick people, but then you just pick somebody, not in response to a raised hand. Just like, okay, Joe, I need you to respond. Voluntary participation is what we're maybe more used to, which is, hey, raise your hand and then I'll call on you. The research is pretty clear here that cold calling actually increases voluntary participation. So if you do some cold calling, students will start to volunteer because otherwise they know they might get cold called. And it seems to increase comfort with the learning process and the discussion technique, and that these outcomes are shown to be stronger the more cold calling you do and the further you get through the semester. So I find this kind of shocking because in terms of anxiety, I think cold calling would be more anxiety producing. But there is a lot of research to suggest that controlled levels of anxiety are actually really beneficial to learning. So maybe that's one of the reasons. I'd encourage you to, like I mentioned before, the red card, green card thing, rather than just call on somebody who might be totally unprepared and then leaving them feeling less than, you can use this opportunity to teach students about cards. If you put up a green card, I am free to call on you. If you put up a yellow card, it means you wouldn't want to be my first choice, but you're willing to be called on. And a red card means I just don't feel ready to discuss this topic. So that might be a way that you could do cold calling that is comfortable for you and your students. But it's an interesting finding, so I wanted to present it to you guys. And there you go. Okay, so am I going to send some chats? Okay. Sorry about that, y'all. So, okay, so, oh God, bunch of them. Okay, so 2 pair share, yep, that can really work. At the end of the semester, they'll all be friends if rotations work. Yeah, and that's exactly what you want. I think it's good to have a sense of community that remains beyond the end of the semester, and I agree. I couldn't agree more. These are the kinds of things that will actually improve our discussion techniques with our students. So I think those are super valuable. And watch their eyes, yes. I mean, again, I'll say you guys are the best people to know your own students, and if they're not prepared, if they look like a deer in the headlights when you say, I'm about to do some cold calling, maybe you don't pick on them, but then you can encourage people, it really makes it a lot more fun if everybody's prepared. So, yeah. So again, I give you a moment to rate yourself privately from 0 to Rockstar on how you use active preparation for discussion, what kinds of things you do for that, small group discussion, trying to make use of sometimes small groups, not always the full class. Do you grade participation? And do you encourage community in your classroom to improve comfort with discussion? And do you ever cold call your students? Lauren, okay, I got you. You're switching to phone. Okay, sorry, we will be absolutely thinking of you. And remember, you can unmute yourself, I think. I don't know if you can do that from the phone. You could always speak if you want to instead. And have a safe drive. Okay, so I'll give you a second to rate yourself on these, and then we'll move on with the ideas. Okay, so If you need any more time, chat in that you do, but I'm going to move on. We'll start talking about which ideas you want to cover for Chapter 2. Okay, so we're going into the ideas. Here's my list for Chapter 2. We've got idea number 12, which is snowball. Oh, and for those of you guys, I didn't mention this last time, the ones that are listed as new, we did this series last semester, but I promised that this time we were going to add some additional ideas. So those are the ones that weren't covered last semester. So snowball is a technique that you use to increase comfort with the discussion technique, where you start giving students a chance to reflect privately, then you get them to pair with somebody, then you take two pairs and put them together, and so on until you get to as large of a group as you'd like. You can go all the way to full class or keep it in small group, but snowball really gives students a chance to get their bearings and get used to the discussion technique before asking them to discuss with a large group. So that's snowball. What if is a discussion technique where you provide a real event, or it could be a current event if your class goes that way. It could be something that you did in lab if your class is that type of thing. It could be something from the reading, or if you're doing literature, it could be an event that happened in a book. So you provide an event to the students, and then as a discussion topic, you ask them to manipulate one variable from that event. So change one thing, how might that have altered the outcome? Gives them really good practice with critical and hypothetical and deductive thinking. And so that is just one technique for an actual topic of discussion. That's called What If, and it's idea 13. Oh, so Lynn's saying that's what you call two-pair share. Are you talking about snowball? Okay, great, yeah. And so it goes by many names, and so I'm glad you've connected it to something that you already do. That's awesome. And Lynn says, great for ethical decision making. Yeah, absolutely, because you can say, what if we change this one thing and make it seem a little dicier than it was before? How do you handle the ethics of that now? So I think that can be really good. All right, think, pair, share is an oldie but a goodie. It's similar to snowball. You give students a moment to think and reflect. Then you ask them to pair up with one other individual. They share their thoughts together, and then that small group, that pair, will then share with the entire class. So this is a way to do class-wide discussions, but instead of cold calling students with no prep time, you could cold call on them in pairs, which is a lot more comfortable. So that's think, pair, share. And when you go into the share component, you don't have to do everybody. You pick the folks you want to do. So circle of voices is idea number 18, and I connect this one to Lord of the Flies. If you remember, they had a conch shell and they would pass the conch, and that was the person who was allowed to speak. So circle of voices, you can do it whole class, you can do it small groups, but essentially you elect one person to start the discussion, and then they get to call on the next person and sort of pass the conch to that next person until everybody's had a turn. So that's a great one. If you've ever had that one student, I'm talking about that one student who answers every discussion question and won't let anybody else have a turn. If you've ever had that student, circle of voices is a good technique to use to train people to share the time evenly. And then the last one is seated discussion. This one I really like. You present some discussion topics ahead of time to your students so they know what they're going to be expected to discuss. Then you do your lesson or your reading or whatever you have, and then afterwards you take some time to discuss the topics that you promised them they were going to be thinking about. It gives them a chance to really prepare, and I think that can be valuable. Okay, all right, so here's your chance. I want you guys to vote in and chat in to me the ideas that you are most interested in. Okay, so Lynn's saying number 20 or number 18. Okay, so let's see if we can get another idea. So Lauren, oh, Helen's in, okay. Okay, so we've got 18. Am I right? Is that everybody now? Because we had one person who was going to phone. Okay, all righty. So we are going to do circle of voices, and we'll do seated discussion, and then maybe I'll pick an extra one for funsies. All right. So I'm going to start with circle. All right. So circle of voices. So as I mentioned, this is a really great technique to use if you've got a student who overshares, or if you've got a lot of students who don't share at all. So it really gives people the chance to practice sharing that time. So the preparation for this one is pretty simple. You need to come up with some material that's going to serve as a discussion seed and then provide it to your students. So you could give them a reading ahead of time, you can give them some questions, you can do a mini lecture, but whatever you do, you need to first choose the material that you're going to have as your discussion seed. Then you're going to explain this method to your students and have them break into small groups. You can also, the authors mentioned, do this with the whole class, but the small groups, we've already talked about why there's benefits to that. So you give them the discussion seed, and the first person in each group who raises their hand gets to start. So paying homage to that person who's always excited to talk, you let them have a moment. So the first person responds to that seed, and then you can call time, or if people are going on too long, or you can let them handle it organically. But then after that person's had their turn, they ask the rest of the group to raise their hands, who wants to be called on next, and then they pass it to that person. And you're not allowed to raise your hand twice in this technique. You've got to pass that to each person. And so you go on until everyone has responded, and then if you like, and if you have time for it, you can select a final person from that group to report to the class as a whole. That's an option. A lot of these techniques will have a report out option that people enjoy. So again, really just like pass the conch and really giving our students a chance to all have their voice heard. So if you would do a gut check and let me know what you think. 1, you don't think it would be all that helpful. 5, you think this is something you might be able to try in your class. So Lynn says, I have a big purple ball activity I do. So you could pull that back in. Yeah, that would be a fun way to do it. Instead of having to do the hand raising, you could do the purple ball toss. I love that. And Helen says that you're interested in trying, and Lynn says you could reinforce that, keeping the main idea at play. Absolutely. So if you're doing it with the whole group, you can really facilitate that discussion. In smaller groups, you can just walk around and circulate and reinforce folks that, nope, we're addressing this question. We're focused on this topic right now. So if you're going to have the chance to speak, you need to be speaking on that topic. So yeah, it can maybe help with some of that chattiness that we have to struggle with. All right, so that's circle of voices. And seated discussion, I think, was the other one that y'all had chosen. So that's here. And so again, as I mentioned, this is where you provide discussion questions ahead of time. It can really make people feel more comfortable with a class discussion if they know what is coming. And so the class period before the discussion, you give a reading assignment, and then give 2 to 3 questions that you're planning on discussing in the next class. You can modify this by doing it within a lecture. So you could, ahead of the lecture, say, here are 2 or 3 discussion questions that we're going to be attacking after this part of the lecture, and then you can do the mini lecture, and then you can launch into the discussion. So it really can be used with readings or with lecture. You can do this in small groups or with the whole class. I know what the research says, but students will take some time to discuss each question provided. You can cold call. You can also allow for volunteers, but then the instructor will sum it up at the end. If you struggle with students staying on task, this is a great opportunity to incorporate that grading into your discussions. While they're discussing, they have to write down some of the information that they've collected for these seated discussion questions, and they can even turn those papers into you as the instructor. You can read through those and help summarize. It's a great way because now you've got an artifact and you can check to see that they're discussing in a way that you think is appropriate, that they're getting the main points that you want. And if a group makes a particularly interesting contribution, you can call that out. So I think that that can be a really valuable technique for incorporating discussion into a classroom. And again, reminding students that they have to be prepared. That's really what this does very well. So take a minute and do a gut check on this one from 1 to 5. Let's see, I'm seeing some comments. So Helen says that the EDUC textbook has some ideas that would work well with this. Yeah, so if you have your instructor's manual or any resources that provide some good discussion topics, this is a great way because now you've got the topics, you just need to give them the materials. So Lynn says maybe she would play with it. Cool. All righty, so I'm going to attack what if as my choice for today, since I get to do that. It's such a decadence to be able to pick one as well. So I'm going to show you guys what if, because I really like this one. Let me please again, but okay. So students can examine an actual event and hypothesize how things would change. And one of you had mentioned that you could use this to discuss ethics. I see we have some sign language interpreter trainers and some folks from student development. And so I think that this technique could be really valuable in all of those programs. So you pick a suitable event ahead of time. If you just want students to have practice communicating with each other, you might be able to pick something that's current events. You could pick an example. I don't know about y'all, but a lot of my textbooks will have these sidebars where they sort of do an interview with a person, or they share a person who is exploring a career in your field, and you can talk about that. But you would essentially present the event or the sidebar or whatever you have, and then share it with the students so everyone's on the same page, and then identify one variable that you'll plan to change. As the semester goes on, the authors encourage us to consider allowing students to select what variable to change. And I've done that when we discuss research in my psych classes. I'll present a famous study, and then I'll ask them, like, how could you do this study differently? What one variable would you like to mess with? And after they've been exposed to that for a while, they can pick the variable on their own. So that's a lot of fun. And then you determine a time frame, which really helps limit how long this is going to take in class. Oh, I'm seeing some chats. Let me bounce up to them real quick. I already know a big 5 for this, using ethical dilemmas. Yeah, so if you've got a topic, you can present, that scenario and say, okay, here's what this person did, but what if we changed this one thing? So that's a great way to attack this one. So the process in class, you announce the activity, you tell students how the discussion is going to go. It's a great chance to say, hey, this isn't where we chat with each other. This is where we really focus on, hypothesizing and thinking about what if. Then you're going to want to give them a little prep time. You could do it outside of class as a reading assignment. You could do it in class, however you prefer, and with whatever time constraints you've got. Then you form small groups to discuss it, and then the authors encourage us to debrief as a class with this one. It really will give you the chance to hear some of the variables that groups came up with, or to guide students. If you think that their hypotheses are incorrect, you can ask them to clarify. You can share why you think these responses might be better. But it really gives students the chance to exercise and try that kind of reasoning, which is so much of a deeper learning technique than just asking them to listen and respond to our, questions. So they're really going to be able to do some what-ifing on their own. So I think it can be a real valuable one. So we already got 1-5 from Lynn, but if you want to gut check in now, oh no, that was the previous one. Okay. So Helen, if you want to chat in what you think from 1 to 5, that would be great. Not sure how to fit it in yet, and that's okay. So let me look. And you're teaching. You're in the EDUC 1300 class. Is that what I have correct? Yeah. Okay. So you could present. I could imagine a test outcome. So I've actually done this with my students. After they've taken an exam, I ask them to look at the questions that they got right or that they got wrong, and then I challenge them with the what-if technique to discuss in groups what could have been one thing they did differently in their studying to have a better outcome. So you can say, hey, how did you study for this question that you did poorly on? What could you do differently? I've even encouraged people to say, okay, on question 1, who did great on it? and then they can find the person and that person shares what they did. So that's one thing that might fit in your area that I think could be valuable, but I'm sure that you could think of other ones because you're closer to your material than I am. All right, so let's bounce to the list of all of the techniques from chapter 2. So we have covered what if, we covered circle of voices, and we covered seated discussion. And so Lynn had already mentioned that she's kind of excited about trying those ethical dilemmas with what if. But if you guys have any other things that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them. And I also really like the idea about the passing the ball instead of relying on raised hands. I thought that was super cool as well. But I'm going to give you a minute to think about what you might like to do and how you might want to incorporate your favorite one into class, and then chat it in so we can all see. And I'm drinking water. Okay, so I see Lynn is saying she wants to use the circle of voices for an activity today. Awesome! Talking about chunking of interpreted text. Okay, so I'm going to need a little clarification. I know what I call chunking, but I don't know what you're talking about. So maybe share a little more if you're able. But I'm thrilled that you're excited to use it already. And then Helen says, I want to use what if to spark some engaging conversation, and she'll find a spot for it. Want, not what. Oh, okay. I gotcha. I was like, what does that mean? What, not what? I see. So you want to use what if. Gotcha. Okay, so Lynn says they'll listen, watch the text, and tell me when it should be chunked and why. Oh, for separating how much information they should present when they interpret? Is that what you're talking about? Okay. All right, cool. That sounds great. That sounds like a really cool way. And so you'd be able to give each person a chance to weigh in on where the appropriate breaking points would be. I love that idea. It's very cool. To interpret a meaningful chunk of info and not word for word. Okay, exactly. So you want to go with concepts rather than just disparate ideas, which are hard to connect. So yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, and why? So that everyone will start to understand the ways that they should be separating the information. And you can weigh in too. You know, if you hear students making, you know, chunks that you think are inappropriate, it's a great way as you're walking around to go, oh, let me tell you why I wouldn't go that way, or it's a great idea, but, okay, and then Lynn's saying bingo. So you're thinking about using that bingo thing as well. Oh, or bingo. I got it. You mean bingo, like right on. Sometimes chatting isn't the same as hearing people's voices. I've got you now. Bingo. All right. Well, cool. Wow, I have just enjoyed the heck out of this, and I appreciate you guys so much playing along and sharing your thoughts. I think it's so valuable when teaching colleagues get together and talk about what we do and how we can do it differently. So I thank you so much. I am, as promised, I will be sending you guys an email in the next day or so with these slides. And also, if you're interested in participating in future ones, because we'll cover all the rest of the chapters in the book, one each month, please take a peek at the Computerside Chats website and sign up for those, because I'd love to get this even bigger. And I will be sending out an evaluation. At the FCTL, I try to evaluate every session we do. And since you're not right here with me, I can't get you to fill out an evaluation form, but I'll send you an anonymous evaluation in the next few days. And I'd really appreciate you responding to that. It helps us keep demonstrating to the administration why we need to be doing things like this. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you have any suggestions for improvement, you can reply back to the email that I'm going to send to you, or you can shoot me an email at fctl@austincc.edu. Let me see. You guys are chatting in. So, oh, you guys, thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Helen says, send us a survey. Oh, thank you. Promise, the survey is headed your way. So I will absolutely send you that eval, and I would love for you to give me your thoughts on how to improve this. And do share it with your colleagues if you find it useful. I think the best way to get more people involved is word of mouth. We've all done, events that aren't useful for us, and then we've done some that are. And so if you hear from a colleague that something's actually worth your time, you're more likely to show up. So I would love it if you guys would be willing to spread the word and work with me again. So that is it for us. I want to be honoring y'all's time, and so we're getting out just a couple minutes early, but I'm going to stick around till 11:30. So if you have any last-minute questions, or you want to unmute yourself and talk, or you want to chat in, let me know, and I will be back in touch with you guys very soon. So thanks so much for coming.